Just about live there. Now we're live. I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. This is our Thursday edition. Today is Thursday, April 28th, 2022. And we're pleased to continue what I call a conversation among friends, among companions. I use the word companions in reference to the book called The Way of Companions by Ikwe Arma, right? And I've been on a voracious reading binge, all things Arma, and I feel I'm learning a lot. I'm excited about it. So I'll be testing what I know as I speak, hopefully being challenged along the way. The principle that I'm focusing on mostly is the idea of our people finding a way to connect themselves with each other. And in doing so, he describes it in one of his books, finding their way home. And home is a place where you, I think, culturally, spiritually, mentally originate and are in the position to be part of the continuum of birth, rebirth, evolution, innovation, and historicity. So with that, let me first of all say thanks to our colleague and friend, Dr. Irma McLaurin. She's joining us again from Johannesburg, South Africa. Welcome back to Brother Ndugu Yusuf Mjini, regular partner, friend, colleague, master communicator, and my friend and classmate from kindergarten, author, novelist, reporter, journalist, educator, Brenda Lyle Gray. Others may join us along the way. Irma, let me start with you, though, by thanking you for being here and asking you to give us a briefing, an update on what's going on in South Africa. Yeah, a major presentation today, right?
I did. I gave a virtual lecture to one of the universities here, UNISA, and on what's today? Today is, I'm getting the days confused, but 2 days ago on the 26th, I gave another in-person lecture at Wits University at their Center for Diversity and had a wonderful crowd. And then the next day was South African Independence Day. So I got a chance to be on the radio and talk about my ideas of freedom and to see people in the streets playing music and dancing and celebrating the day. So it's been quite something. I would like to focus on Cape Town. I spent 3 days there. And I was able to connect with Elizabeth Horn Peterson, who you say you're going to have on your show one day. She's a phenomenal person who runs an organization called Faith and Family. But one of the most remarkable things is that she has curated and created an exhibit called MAD, Men Affirming Dignity. And what it's about is showing the positive sides of colored African men. Now, they use colored as a way of talking about mixed people. And many of us, when we go to Africa, we just assume that we're Black, that we're going to be with the Africans. But in truth, African Americans in South Africa would be colored, because of our mixture, historical. She also is from the Kusan and explained to me that they were the only people who were actually enslaved in their own country. So we went to the Slave Lodge, which is a building that is this ornate building, but it also held 7,000 slaves. Wow. And they used to do things like name them by the months: January, February, March, April. And what they've been able to do is they've turned it into a museum to tell the real history of slavery in Cape Town, because they brought in slaves from Malaysia, from other parts of the world. So it wasn't just African slaves. And they went and found the descendants, people whose names are January, February, March, to trace them back to their enslaved descendants.
Irma, who brought them in?
They were brought in by the Dutch. I think the British too. I'm trying to think of who were the originals. I think it was the Dutch, though. It was the Dutch. Yes, it was the Dutch. It was the West Indian Company that brought them in. And so on the Cape Town is on the ocean, And so it was originally thought to be a layover place that the ships on their way to the rest of Africa could stop there, pick up supplies. But it ended up not happening that way. And so they kept slaves. 7,000 slaves came through there, and they're now trying to go back and reconstruct that history. What Elizabeth is doing, though, is that she's really trying to show a different side. In Cape Town, colored African men are presented as, gangsters and thugs and violent. And so she wanted to show a very different side of this. And she has curated a wonderful exhibit. They are interviews with people, including her father, and then each one is like in a case, so it could be closed up and carried. So there is a flat screen inside each case that that has the video. They're all signed by men, which is colored men. She made sure that the project was only the people working on it were only Black men or Black people. And so it's a very powerful exhibit because you're getting these stories of extraordinary men who are community organizers, who were part of the community, who have, supported their families, and who show the positive side of men in South Africa. And so it was quite an emotional journey to go through the exhibit and then to see the rest of it, where the tree where they used to sell slaves, there's a plaque in the floor for that. The bell that they used to ring to announce the slave,
Wow.
the selling of slaves is there. But they're now trying to recover the history of the people who were enslaved in that building. And the building is very ornate. And so it just seems like such a contrast, have this incredibly ornate, almost Romanesque, kind of building, and then to know what was going on there. And she talked about the fact that when it opened, there were people who were very emotional because the very bricks that you're walking on, the path that you're standing on, was built by slaves. And so their descendants, to know that it was their blood, sweat, and tears that made this building possible.
I have a quick question on location. And Yusuf, you might know this because I think it was discussed before, but was Biko banned in Cape Town or in Johannesburg?
He is, as far as I know, he was in, well, let me not, I'd have to look it up because
Okay.
they have, he's being honored in Cape Town and also in Johannesburg, so I think he spent time in Cape Town, but I think he was in Johannesburg because in fact, someone took me to, when I did a tour today, there's a building that was where they used to incarcerate the students. And they said Biko was held there for a brief period of time. But I know that in the museum in Cape Town, he's also in, some of the materials they have there. So I don't know if he spent time there as well.
Because I know there's a memorial in Soweto because that's
Mm-hmm.
where he was heading
Right.
to work with the kids, and that's when he got caught by de Klerk or whoever the can't think of the guy that slapped him. But anyway, I was wondering, I was trying to get the locations. That just sounds so powerful, Dr. Irma.
And it was because what she showed me was that she said this whole area of downtown Johannesburg was basically police and rubber bullets and tear gas. And so they had taken the protesters had taken over the streets. So what some of the offices did was to build a walkway between buildings so they wouldn't have to come into the streets. And that walkway still exists.
Wow.
Take a minute and all of us go through and explain who Biko was. Stephen Biko, a pivotal figure in the freedom movement, not only in South Africa, but in the world. And this is a great way to take an aside and talk about him in the context of even where we are today. Irma, Yusuf, Brenda?
Well, I showed Cry Freedom to all of my students, whether they were international baccalaureate or at an alternative school. It didn't matter. I wanted to use that movie to show apartheid, and that there are good white people in this country, or in the world, because the editor, Donald, can't think of that, shows you I'm 75. But anyway, Steve Biko was, he was just powerful, and he was brilliant, and he was so committed to freeing children, and he knew what was going on in Soweto. And anyway, long story short, he was murdered by the South African police, and they even blocked the people from going to his funeral. And the book Cry Freedom sort of tells his story and opens up how the two of them, Mandela and Biko, basically freed the people in South Africa. That's why I was trying to get the location straight. But
and I think he would say that it was a people's movement. I mean, children were in the streets. I was going Wits University, where I spoke on the 26th. You know, I was told this is the site of where students confronted police. They were in the streets, and parents would not know if their children were coming home that day, because the police would take them, incarcerate them, and apparently it was legal for them to hold them up to 93 days without charging them. Yeah, and they did it.
I did a paper in graduate school comparing Biko and the kids, the civil rights children, you know, because they got to the point where, you know, our children were in jail because I mean, so it's a powerful story. And I always say I had a Siberian Husky named Biko. His name was Biko Ash. And it was just something about him. And it was something about that movie, and something about the intensity of his passion. I never will forget, he didn't really know who to trust. And he would go into a neighborhood bar, and he didn't know whether the madams are, you know, were turning him in. He lived on pins and needles all the time, but he still operated with such power and such dignity and such brilliance. He was just so keen on things. That had to be a wonderful experience, and kudos to you. That is just beautiful. I want to hear more later on.
One of the reasons that Steve Biko was so revered is because much of his work was done in the Bantustans, the lands where blacks were required to be after sundown. If they worked in the white neighborhoods or provided services or did landscaping or whatever, they couldn't live in those communities. They had to leave and go back to what were the homelands. And the common people occupied the Bantustans, the homelands. And Biko worked throughout the homeland areas. And I think he was revered because, as you said, he was among the people, he was of the people, and he was for the people. And they really respected and I think idolized the educational, the activism, and the nationalism that he promoted for South Africa.
But you know, was it Peter Gabriel, Dr. Irma, that did the song called Biko? I wonder if I know there was a song, and I was trying to think of who it was.
I'm not sure. They did have in this Slave Lodge Museum, there is an exhibit on the music that was being created during that time, and the influence of Black American music on people as well. Reggae, Black American music. There were groups that modeled gospel music as well as a form of resistance. So a lot was going on, and so they've begun to tell the story from the lens of the people who were enslaved and not the enslaved or the enslavers. And I think that's really important. And they're trying to do this in lots of different places, which is to tell alternative stories.
One thing that a lot of people don't understand is that at the first annual convention of the NAACP in 1910, W.E.B. Du Bois invited Dr. Samuel Jocko from South Africa. And at the end of the conference, Du Bois asked Samuel Jocko if there was anything that he needed for his return to South Africa. He requested a copy of the Constitution of the NAACP, and they substituted the letters ANC for NAACP, and the Constitution of the African National Congress was the Constitution of the NAACP. And then in 1956, they removed the reference to nonviolence and said, it will only be through armed liberation that we liberate the people of South Africa. And they made a commitment for the ANC to support armed liberation struggle in Tanzania or South Africa. So the African continent has always looked to African Americans for inspiration and motivation. And the civil rights movement was very inspirational for Biko, for Mandela, for a lot of people. And a lot of people don't realize that the single person who played the greatest role in the liberation of countries in Southern Africa was Fidel Castro, because he sent doctors, he sent nurses, he sent military, he sent equipment into Zimbabwe, into
Angola, Mozambique,
into Angola. And when they went into Southwest Africa, they ran the South Africans out. And the Cubans said, if you don't deal with Nelson Mandela and the prisoners in Robben Island, we're coming to South Africa next. And de Klerk said, where's that Mandela guy? out of
I hadn't heard that.
Right away. That's why Mandela was released, because the South Africans, both de Klerk, all of them, were fearful that the Cubans were going to go from Zimbabwe into South Africa. And the rest is history. And when the prime minister of Haiti, the former priest, was kidnapped by the CIA and taken to the Central African Republic after a coup, guess who it was who was the only president or premier that provided shelter and refuge for Aristide, the democratically elected president of Haiti, because Colin Powell, and I call her Condoleezza de Schiza, called every prime minister in the Caribbean and said, if you provide refuge for Aristide, his wife, and 2 daughters, we will punish you for generations. Wow. It was Nelson Mandela, who, and Maxine Waters, Randall Robinson, and another brother who was a helicopter pilot, a veteran, black U.S. veteran, took Aristide, his wife, and 2 daughters from the Central African Republic, where the CIA had thought they had deposited them permanently, to South Africa. And it was Nelson Mandela who provided them with refuge, with housing, with diplomatic support, until Aristide was able to leave South Africa and return to the Caribbean. So
story.
We have a lot of, it's the Black liberation struggle is a continuum, from Marcus Garvey, Martin Delany, Martin Luther King. All these folks are on the same train, headed in the same direction. And that's true for our brothers and sisters on the continent as well.
Do you know any more about the helicopter pilot, Yusef?
I'm sorry?
Do you know any more about the helicopter pilot, the black?
He accompanied Randall Robinson and Maxine Waters. And Randall Robinson wrote a book called Haiti, An Unending Agony, and pointed out that Haiti is the only country on this planet who had to pay reparations to the country that they defeated when they won their liberation. And Haiti had been paying reparations to France for almost 200 years. And on the 200th anniversary of the Haitian Revolution, they invited the president or the premier of France to attend. And he said, oh no, it's too soon. We still feel the pain of the income that the plantation owners lost when you freed the slaves in Haiti. Okay.
Ooh,
And
wow.
Dessalines, Toussaint, and
Mhm.
the other brothers ran the French, the British, and the Americans out of Haiti. And that's the only successful slave revolt in this hemisphere. Okay.
And it's why Haiti suffers in the world today as well,
Yeah.
because the
People wonder why
conspiracy is to
they're so
ensure
poor. Yeah.
that Black people don't feel they can overthrow the yoke of white supremacy and prosper. That's been the modus operandi for the colonist, the imperialist.
Here's how
And
bad it is, Al.
yeah,
Aristide and his family were kidnapped in the middle of the night by the CIA and flown to the Central African Republic because he had raised the minimum wage for Haitians working on plantations from $1 a day to $2 per day. That's in our current times. Okay.
well, the same story unfolded in Liberia when Liberia questioned the carte blanche that Firestone and Western business interests had in shaping the quality of life, the way of life for all of their people, and they began to ask more for their labor and their resources, and that was met with the wiping out of the entire leading family of Liberia. Irma, let me go back to you. When you mentioned something about a thought that sparked a memory that sparked your comment about the gradations, the color, colored versus Black Americans, et cetera. And that reminded me of a conversation I had here on KFAI. I think it was in the studio with Riek Machar. Riek Machar was General Riek Machar, the vice commander of the Sudanese People's Liberation Army. He was also vice chair of the Sudanese People Liberation Front, so the political and military. He was a soldier. And we were interviewing, and I asked him something. He talked about the Arabized Africans, and the sound of that was intriguing to me. You know, what is an Arabized African? Who are they? How do they look? And he said, they look like you. Just like you all do. All of you Africans in America that have been Americanized. So I thought, Arabized African, Americanized Africans. There we go.
Is it because they're Muslim?
And I think it's
No,
it's
it's
important
because
to understand
of the
that
cultural and genetic imposition.
Right.
Yeah,
Wow.
that's
and
what
it's not about color. Colored is just a classification. It
Right.
had nothing to do with skin color per
It's not.
se. It had to do with mixture. They were the mixed people, and they were mixed with African, with Malaysia, with Indian, with with Dutch or Afrikaans. And so it's the mixture, and we represent that in the United States. I
Yep.
mean, all you have to do, everybody who has ancestry, you got some European blood in you, you got some I tell people I'm an African mutt because when I look at my ancestry, it's the largest portion is Nigerian, like 27 or 32%. But then it's got Mali, it's got Senegalese, it's got, Bush, it's got, because the idea in America was never to put people together who spoke the same language, because then they would be able to unite. So we had to create
Absolutely.
Ebonics, as we call
Absolutely.
it, because that was the only way to communicate, because they were putting people together who didn't have the same language. We talk about Africans, but we have to understand people were coming from different places. It wasn't all in one, from one place.
They used to limit to people who purchased Africans to no more than 2 from one boat for that
Yes.
very reason, so that the people on the plantations worshiped different gods, spoke different languages, ate different food, had different cultures entirely, which made it very difficult to organize because they saw one another as strangers rather than brothers and sisters.
Right.
Irma, I'm reading Barracoon. Do you know that book?
Yes, by
Zora
Zora Neale Hurston.
Talk about that
And
if you will.
she discovered, I write about this a little bit because in her letters to Langston Hughes, she talks about finding Cujo. the question becomes, why did it take almost 100 years for that book to be published?
Thank
And
you.
the answer is that Zora wrote that book in dialect. She wrote it as she heard it from Cujo. She was also a linguistic anthropologist. You know, she was trained in the four fields by Franz Boas, but she wrote it, and the publisher said, please translate this into standard English, and she refused. And so the manuscript got put aside and was just recently discovered a couple of years ago.
That's so cool.
It's a fascinating read. We're discussing that this week on narrative on Nubia, and the discussion is being led by Dr. Greg Carr, who is the Africana Studies Chair at Howard University, and who's a principal along with Dr. Karen Hunter in this online community called Narrative, and within that the class that we have in a section called Nubia. Fascinating. And what's fascinating is how we are stitching together information about us from all over the world and from across time. And the consequence of that, I believe, is the re-emergence of a certain confidence, a certain capability, and a clarity of thought around our role in authoring the future, in being at the table, and if not at the table, making the table. That is the foundation for the future of our people, and that necessarily, from my point of view, means all of humanity as well. As you are traveling in South Africa, I wanted to show and thank you for the piece that you submitted that we've got in Inside News
Great.
in Monday's paper. Let me pull it up and show it to you.
Oh, okay.
Looking for more. I put it in the chat so you can see it there as well.
Oh,
It
okay.
was great. It
Let me
was
hit the
great.
share button just 1 second here. I've got to move my screen around so I can see.
I went back to school.
Oh, did you?
Just a second here.
But I didn't know this story that you, Steph, just said. I've got to go back and research that. That's phenomenal.
Yeah, it is. That's the continuum that we're on, like it or not. 2
from each boat. Wow.
Yeah.
And this is Monday's edition of Inside News. That is the lead into Brenda's story on energy in solar energy in North Minneapolis. So
what a powerful photograph. I said, look at this creative slant. My goodness.
And here's your piece. Goodbye, Zimbabwe. Walk us through that piece and bring us back to what you're doing right now as you were beginning, because you had some phenomenally interesting comments last week about your impressions and experiences in Zimbabwe. And you put that to pen.
I mean, I think we don't understand how economics drives so many things, and particularly how countries were affected by COVID. And, Zimbabwe is just in an economic mess. Everything is cash driven. People don't trust the banks, that you can't use credit cards there. There are no ATMs. And so I was just struck by the fact that just going there, you usually take a few $100s in cash, right? But it was such a cash driven economy that within 5 days, I was almost out of cash. Right. And I'm like, oh, my God, what am I going to do? Because when I went to change my dollars into Zimbabwe money, the person at the change window said, you're better off keeping the dollars because the exchange rate is so low that you're not going to get much out of it. So the very person I'm going to change money to local currency is saying, don't use local currency because nobody wants it. And so I was just struck by how driven the culture is. And this actually connects to South Africa. A lot of Zimbabweans have come into South Africa. There's a lot of tension around xenophobia. And what South Africans will say to you is that we just gained our freedom and we didn't have a chance to enjoy it before there was this flood of people coming in, because South Africa is more economically stable than any of the, than at least Zimbabwe and some of the other countries. So they have a huge influx of very, a very educated, Zimbabweans were very well educated. And remember, Black South Africans weren't allowed to be educated in the same way. So what they find themselves happening is that they're being driven out of the market that they never had a chance to get the skills to be in, and they feel like they're not enjoying their freedom in their own country because there are all these people coming in and taking, and with skills taking the jobs. So there's no motivation to build the workforce infrastructure internally because you've got all these people coming from outside who will then work for a lot less. They won't demand the same kinds of things that indigenous South Africans might demand. And so there's a lot of tension. There is tension.
Dr. Irma, what are the public safety implications of having to carry a bunch of cash in a cash-driven economy? Does that present problems?
People say be very careful, be very careful not to be ostentatious. And, I left all my good jewelry at home. I put on a watch that I haven't worn in like 25 years. If they want it, they can have it, But you have to be very cautious in terms of navigating that. So we tended to work with a taxi driver that was known to the people at the guest house we were staying with. I mean, you can't just like, I took Ubers around Johannesburg. I don't know that I would take an Uber, in Zimbabwe because, people were very comfortable driving Ubers and things like that here because the level of safety is very different. In Zimbabwe, one, Uber doesn't work. And two, you have these taxis and you don't know what you're getting into if you're going to get to your destination. So people just say proceed with caution. And the best thing is to have someone who knows someone call a taxi so you know who the driver is. But the rates are exorbitant, as I talk about, which is that, $10 to get to one place. And then if you want to change and go to a different destination, it's another 10. And then to get back to your place, it's another 10.
Wow.
That means you've now spent $30 just to go to one or two places.
Dr.
And that's
Irma,
per day. That's a day.
Was that not the fight with the kids in Soweto that they did not want to be taught Afrikaans?
Yes, that was the catalyst.
That was sort of the beginning of this, language and identity. I can just
and it was children. It was children who were protesting. I think it's really important. It wasn't adults.
No,
the protest started with children saying, "No, we're not gonna learn this language." And it was literally children. And they talk about like their buildings in some of the exhibits in the slave lodge. They do have one that's about the protest, and there were children who were killed, who were being shot. And we're talking 7, 8, 10-year-old children who were being killed.
Those kids climbing the walls, trying to get away.
Right.
Yeah.
The other thing that's in that exhibit is that apparently there were people who were in the movement who then were turned into agents against the protesters. Yeah. And there was a whole unit of people who formerly were actually protest activists who then turned and worked for the South African police, and they were noted to be the most horrific, brutal unit. And that story is told.
That told Revette where to find Biko on the highway.
Yeah.
Was it the guy behind the cardboard box or something? But anyway, they were that group. That one guy was the one that turned him in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But people talk about the brutality of this group. It was like turning them, blacks being turned on blacks and being more brutal than even the South African police. And nobody, I didn't hear anything where people said why they would do that. So we don't know what the motivation is. Maybe that will come out at some point. Who knows? Their families may have been in harm. I mean, we just don't know. But that is one aspect of what happened.
Where is truth and reconciliation right now in South Africa?
Well, I think, from what I can see, it happened. I think people are still dealing with aspects of, for example, there was a show on advertising, and people saying, yes, we have these laws that say 51% of businesses should be owned by, Black South Africans. But in truth of fact, people are finding ways to get around that. So, I mean, I think, South Africa is in an imperfect state. It is still growing and developing. I mean, we're talking about a country where apartheid just ended, 25 years ago or so.
90s.
And we're talking,
but
comparing that to a country where we've had over 300 years or whatever of an American Revolution, and we're still not there yet,
No.
right?
One of the
So
concessions.
I think it's a country in process. It's
One-
still growing, developing,
Yeah.
trying to
Irma?
find its way, trying to find the right government structure. The ANC can be problematic. Not everyone is happy with how things are playing out. And youth are very engaged, though, that I find very interesting. They were on the radio station, they're going to schools. That was very positive to
That's
see.
a good thing to hear.
Yeah.
But one of the concessions that was made in South Africa is that the pension systems would remain in place for the judges, for the government, for the police, for the people who worked, the white people in South Africa, so that they would enjoy all of the benefits that they believed they had coming. Much of the mineral development and the ownership, De Boers and all of the giant white South African companies continued to own, maintain, and run those businesses and reap those profits. So you have a functional government, but a lot of the people in it are functionaries because a lot of the resources that are generated are already committed and being paid to retired judges, retired police, retired military, and the people who kept the system of apartheid operating are still benefiting from their employment. And
and they're having to deal with questions of greed. And there's a family, the Guptas, who are Southeast Asian, where their assets have been frozen because they got billions of dollars from the South African government. They were the people who got the contracts, and people said they would make the decisions about who got certain roles in government. So you have, you still have this, liberation does not mean that people are going to necessarily take a totally different track. What we practice, what we learn,
or that
and
they're able
sometimes
to,
what we take are the worst of things.
or that they're even able to set up an entirely new system. They have to use what they've got to get where they need to go, and it's very imperfect.
Yeah.
Seth, I've always described you as a Pan-Africanist, and I want to throw out that question from your sense, your vision of Pan-Africanism, and Dr. Irma McFarlane on the ground and as an anthropologist. Where do you see us presently in the spectrum or on the arc of the development of African people? That through the lens of Pan-Africanist ideology. Yusuf and then Irma?
Standing behind the Chinese, who are buying up everything that stands still on the continent. We've got 83 U.S. military bases in the 53 independent nations on the continent. And the Chinese have got a significant foothold in many of the countries that have the minerals that are required, that are available nowhere else, for cell phones, for flat screen televisions, for IT, for space travel, for precious minerals, diamonds, gold, you name it. And the Chinese have bought up a lot of land in the United States that is part of the National Park Service, part of the reserve forestry. Chinese are spending money like crazy to get a toehold anywhere that they can for future development, and they have done that very aggressively in Africa, more than all the rest of the other countries combined. And you combine that with the 83 military bases who were established to provide stability so that those minerals could continue to be raped from the earth and shipped to Europe, to America, to South America, refined, that are obtained for $2 a ton, and then they sell it back for $5,000 a pound after they've refined it. So we're on the receiving end. Kwame Nkrumah declared the independence of Ghana, and the Nestle's Cocoa Company emptied their warehouses all over the world and dropped the price of cocoa phenomenally. And all of the Ghanaian farmers took their pitchforks and went to the capital because they blamed Kwame Nkrumah for declaring the independence of Ghana. It's really sad. The richest man in the world before Putin was this. I'm sorry, I almost called him an asshole on your program. From the
You
Congo.
just did. Go ahead.
The one who worked for the CIA for 25 years and who murdered hundreds of thousands of people in the Congo. He tried to compete with the King of Belgium, okay, who King Leopold, who killed so many people in the Congo. There's a book that Mark Twain wrote that was banned in this country for 50 years called King Leopold's Soliloquy. King Leopold killed so many people in what was then called the Belgian Congo. You could have built a fence with the bodies and linked hands from New York all the way to San Francisco. Okay, more than 1 million people killed.
Yes,
and,
it was a Holocaust. It was a Holocaust.
Sure, it was. And we used to say that under colonialism, somebody else shoots you. Under neocolonialism, you get to shoot yourself. Yeah. And I think a lot of because of the coups, because of the takeovers, because of the influence of the United States and the multinational corporations, that a lot of the countries exist under external pressure in almost a fashion of black neocolonialism, because there are black people who are in the key figure positions, but the benefits, the resources, the profits, all the outputs are leaving the country as fast as the stimulus money left the hood when we got it from the federal government last year. Okay, took about 20 minutes for that money to flee. And the slaves used to say, capture knowledge, fly to freedom. Okay, and what needs to be happening are schools, more people like Dr. Irma providing food for thought and information, and people developing their own nation-building liberation skills. The the State Department went to Liberia and told them that if they met with Marcus Garvey, who wanted to establish a black colony in Liberia, not for everybody, but for engineers, architects, doctors, teachers, nurses, people with skills, they said, if you meet with Marcus Garvey, the United States government is going to rain hell on you. And instead, he met with the Ku Klux Klan and told them, I am as violently black as you are violent. I'm as violently a Negro as you are violently white. Okay. And if you mess with us, we'd be happy to prove it to you. Okay. So Marcus Garvey employed 6,000 people in his corporations. He had the Black Nurses Corps. Mm-hmm. He had UNIA universities. Elijah Muhammad was sentenced to prison in Sandstone, Minnesota for enrolling his children in the UNIA University in Detroit, where he was located at that time. Marcus Garvey had chapters in 38 states and 72 foreign countries. And if you had a copy of his newspaper anywhere in the British Empire, you were sentenced to life in prison or to death. So,
wow, that's deep.
We're not doing anything new. We are continuing the work that our parents and foreparents and ancestors begun, because we still have a long way to go.
And I think the American model of people becoming gazillionaires, Microsoft and Amazon,
Elon Musk,
has seduced people into thinking that the accumulation of personal wealth is really what it's all about. And so people are getting, people on the ground here are complaining, that there is such corruption and the accumulation of wealth. people are having their girlfriends sit on boards and running, utilities or different kinds of things. And so people just have a lack of trust in leaders, because all they see is once they get in power, that all they're doing is really building their own coffers,
Elon Musk just
and it's not,
banned,
yeah,
Elon Musk just banned Public Citizen from Twitter. It's a progressive alternative news source, very credible, and he's banned them from Twitter. So so much for free speech.
yeah.
What's the impact, Irma? Have you seen the show or not? Maybe you have, Youssef or Brenda. Young, Famous, and African. Are you familiar with that? It's a South Africa-based reality show, but it's just like Crazy Rich Asians or the so-and-so of Hollywood. But this case, it's blinged out South Africans. And
I've seen clips of it. I haven't seen the whole show. I've kind of gotten hooked on some of the soap operas because it's just so nice. Gomorrah is one, but and it's all complicated. But it is just so nice to see Black people acting on these shows. And when you read the credits to see, who the videographers were and who was doing the camera work and all of that stuff. And so I've just kind of been absorbing it. I mean, the stories are crazy, they're complicated, but I did see ads for that, but I haven't watched it. And I don't know that I want to.
That's why people were so upset about what happened at the Oscars, because it was the first time that it was an all-Black production team, and the producer was Black. So
but most people didn't even know that. Most people who were watching the event probably would know that.
Oh no, but after the fact they learned, and they were saying, "Oh my goodness, this opportunity." But
how is it that one act of one person somehow undermines the credibility? This is the problem, and this is where we still are, is that we still have a post-colonial mentality. That when Will Smith is doing his thing, he's like himself, individualistic, and he's all golden. He's the golden boy. But when he makes one mistake, suddenly all of us are complicit. How is that possible?
Yeah,
and we drink that Kool-Aid. We buy into it. We're asking. I was hearing things from Chris Rock's brother. If it had been me, and suddenly now Chris Rock is asking now he's not going to sue him, but he's asking the Oscar people to sue him. It's like, give me a break. That moment, the moment has passed. Let it go. Right? He didn't really hurt you.
They're using the incident to promote the fact that Will Smith is a member of the Church of Scientology.
No, it's not Scientology. It's a different religion, but it's very similar in its outlook, right? But what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? What does it have to do? Absolutely. And so
what did you say a couple of weeks ago, that when there's something negative about us, it's collective?
Yes.
When there's something
I wrote that.
when it's individual, when it's positive, it's individual. When it's negative, it's was collective. The word you used.
Yeah.
So Irma, through the lens of an anthropologist, talk about the question of Pan-Africanist. Where we go, where are we going? Not in the next 20 years, but the next 200, 300, 500 years, given where we have been. What do you see? And
I mean, Pan-Africanism is a political perspective, a political thought. You have to get people in on that. And what are we training our children? Are we educating them about Pan-African notions? Are you teaching your grandson what it means to be a Pan-African? People don't just wake up and become politically minded. It's not something that just you get through osmosis. It has to be cultivated. And so the question is, how are we cultivating these ideas that we are more of a collective than we are these individualistic things? Whether you call it Pan-Africanism, whether you call it diasporic, diaspora thinking, I don't know what to call it. But I'm simply saying is that we cannot rely on people just kind of going along with the program if they don't understand what the program is. right? For me, this is why my archive becomes important, because the documentation for people to be able to go back and see where things began, how they started, what was in that conversation. But I think we have to take responsibility. What are we teaching our children? What are we teaching our grandchildren? What are we teaching, the young people? Because that's the future. It doesn't matter what we think. They are the future. And if they don't understand collectivism, if they don't understand putting community over, one's individual self, then we're lost. We're lost. And I'm seeing that here where people have that concern. I'm not seeing it so much in our country. Our kids are very much caught up in radical individualism and everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. Everybody wants to become a Bill Gates or whatever. They all want to create a Google or a TikTok or an Instagram and become instantly rich, or they spend their time being influencers. So what is an influencer? Someone who posts pictures all the time, and because of how they dress, and that's their job. It's like, how is that a job? And what happens when you get old and people don't want to see your pictures anymore? What are you going to do for a living? And what I read several months ago was that Black influencers were finding that their stuff was being appropriated by whites. Whites would then benefit and get like the sponsorships, right? And they were now having to go through therapy because the pressure to constantly be innovative and produce was creating putting them in a dilemma. They were in crisis. What kind of life is that?
And so the options or the alternatives, Yusef and Brenda, I think Dr. Irma hit it precisely by saying we have to pay attention to our obligation to young people, reorienting and reconnecting, moving along this path of memory, of remembering, reconnecting, rejoining to some foundational idea of who we are and the collective sense that comes out of that. Where do you see that happening right now in community, Yusef? Is there enough of it? There's never enough, but where do you see it right now?
Well, Al, we don't see it in the media, for one. I think the good thing about the internet, and I have to give credit to YouTube, is that there's so much information out there. If people are guided selectively, they can find it, they can use it, they can benefit from it, because we've talked about Gerald Horne, Joseph Benjo-Cannon, John Henry Clark, Francis Welsing, Ivan Van Sertima. The lectures of all of these people are right there on the cell phone, on the monitor, in the libraries, wherever people can access the technology. It's been difficult to get older generations plugged in because it wasn't something that they were accustomed to coming up. The kids who played with Xbox or Pac-Man or whatever it was are very literate. The people in our generation consider themselves Luddites, the Middle Ages people who feared that machines were going to take over the world and eat everybody. That's what a Luddite is. But Pan-African, the word pan means all, okay? And African means us, okay? All the shades of the rainbow. That us means, where did life originate on the continent? 4.5, 5 million years ago, they're still pulling up the oldest bones and the oldest stones, and they look like us, okay? And then we branched all over the planet, and that's where humanity came from. And I mean, Louis Leakey, take your pick. These folks who are honest are all saying civilization had to begin in Africa, okay? Because all of the ingredients necessary for life to develop were there and nowhere else. And, we need to identify, study, explore that, and embrace it. And our kids don't learn anything about anything beyond the borders of the United States. I was in East Germany with a group of people from the Minnesota legislature and a group of foundation presidents and senior people. And we went into a 9th grade classroom and, just walked in out of the hallway unannounced. When they said, "Where are you from?" and I think it was the Speaker of the House said, we're from Minnesota. Those kids knew more about Minnesota than the people in our group combined, each of them. How many hectares, how much wheat we produced, how much of this, how much of that, how many people, what the median income was. And I mean, they knew that information about each of the 50 states in the United States.
Where was this, Yusef?
East Germany, okay?
Wow.
A gymnasium, 9th grade. And if, you know, these kids never heard of Harriet Tubman, okay? In our classrooms, there was a Mexican-American employee at St. Paul Public Schools, Sebastian J. Sam Hernandez, was a high school teacher, retired 5 or 6 years ago, was the only high school principal in St. Paul teaching Black history, high school teacher, all right? And taught it every year to anybody who would attend his classes. And, you know, we've got Chinese immersion, French immersion, Spanish immersion, American Indian Magnet, Hmong language and culture. We've got gifted and talented. We've got classic education. We've got Montessori. We've got 39 immersion schools where kids are immersed in a particular culture. The charter schools, the public schools. Where is the pathway to excellence?
Yes, for Blacks.
For K through 5, for 6 through 8, for 9 through 12, for the kids who've been in the classrooms for 170 years, since the 1850s.
Wow.
Where's the pathway for them? Where is it anywhere? You know, I mean, so when we say who's teaching it or what are we doing and where it's coming from, it's unfortunately, it's coming out of individual households, individual churches, individual families, and individual parents, single moms, teaching it to their children and instilling it in them, because it's not being presented in any collective or organized fashion, other through efforts like Insight, a handful of efforts on cable television, and like I said, on YouTube. There is so much on YouTube that I'm afraid, you know, somebody's going to find it and get rid of it. Like Elon Musk has eliminated. Al, you're familiar with Public Citizen as a news organization.
Yep.
Banned from Twitter.
And I think the other thing we don't realize is that Afro-American studies came of age 2 years ago. Most of the departments are now 50 years old, right? Yeah. They are not replacing the people who retire or die. And if they do, they're not being replaced with Black Americans. You've got everybody who is authorized to teach our history and our literature but us, right?
And many of them have joint appointments.
And parents, if you're not telling your children, your grandchildren that if I send your butt to college and you need to take some Afro-American studies classes, because those programs will die because they don't have the FTE, the full-time equivalent enrollment, right? And so these programs are going from being departments to being programs. And pretty soon they're just going to be a concentration. And then soon they just disappear.
And I would
so we have a responsibility to also advocate for those things to be stabilized. But I like what Yusef is saying is that we've got every kind of immersion, and none of those schools would exist if Black people's struggles had not happened. None of them. They're building it on our platform, but it advances everyone but us.
And on a closing note, next Thursday is May 5th, which all of us know is the 2-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd.
Take a minute, Yusef, and we started mentioning it at the beginning of the show, but take an extra couple of minutes to talk about the state report about the discrimination in the city of Minneapolis and the City of Minneapolis Police Department that speaks right to the issue of the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis.
Let me talk real fast, Al, because it grew out of the murder of George Floyd. And this is not just a local problem, because in city after city, police mishandled the civil protests that people made over police brutality, over the death of George Floyd, as they did over Trayvon Martin, as they did over Brother Brown and Ferguson and all around the country. And the police are trained today more as a paramilitary force than as a public service force.
Right.
Okay. They're, I showed a book that I'm reading last week, which talks about this in great detail. I got to get to the middle of the camera. It's called
That's
Rise
it.
of the Warrior Cop, the Militarization of America's Police Forces. You could ask any black person in America to guess at what the Minnesota Human Rights Department found looking at the last 10 years of stop and frisk, excessive force, police brutality, citations, arrests of black, indigenous people, and people of color in Minneapolis. And it would be obvious. They would say the same thing that happened in Kansas City and Milwaukee and Indianapolis and Gary, Indiana, and Camden, New Jersey, and Philadelphia and DC, that in Minneapolis, white police officers tried to pretend that they were black people and harassed people affiliated with the NAACP and the Minneapolis Urban League, especially black women, derogatory, stereotypical remarks, surveilled on members of those organizations. But they didn't assume names and surveil the white nationalists or the white power groups, the Proud Boys or the Boogaloo Boys or any of those white nationalist groups who were inserting themselves in civic public protest and breaking windows and starting fires in the George Floyd protest. And what the Human Rights Department found is what was found in 27 cities across the country by the New York Times that did after incident reports to look at how the police performed and behaved during the protests for George Floyd. Tear gas, rubber bullets, they treated civil protesters the same way they treated, riotous looters. They were militarized. They did more harm. They created more damage than existed in their attempts they weren't trained, they weren't organized, they weren't communicating, they didn't have the leadership. And the Human Rights Department is recommending that police departments drastically, radically change the training from a paramilitary model to a public service model, that they use community organizers and representatives of marginalized communities to participate in the training. And they also recommend that there be a legal consent decree. Now, in St. Paul, the capital city of Minnesota, we've had a consent decree with the police department and the NAACP since 2001. So the relationship with the community and the performance of the police is night and day between the two cities. In fact, we're fond of saying, please, please don't do a Minneapolis, okay? Because Minneapolis had a cop whose nickname was Thumper, Lieutenant Mike Swirl, and the city paid out millions of dollars in excessive force and police brutality complaints against that one individual. So there weren't a lot of surprises. Who's going to enforce the consent decree and who's going to be involved in creating it and determining what the criteria will be is the real serious issue that we have going forward. And I hope that was fast enough, Al.
That was great. Thank you. Let me close with Brenda. You said you're reading a couple new books. What are you reading now? And Irma, maybe you've had time to read while you're over there.
No.
Give us.
Dr. Irma would really appreciate this. It's by Christopher Emden, and it's for white folks who teach in the hood. ... And the rest of you all too.
So hold it up so they can see it, Brenda.
Whoop. How do I get it there?
Lift it a little.
Yep.
Lift it. There you go. For
Yeah,
white
there
folks
you
who
go.
teach in the hood. Yeah.
Love the title.
The other one is Restorative Justice in the English Language Art Classroom. So I have been working on a curriculum called Make That Change, and I wrote it with one of my former students. And so I had to do a little bit more research outside of my boss's assignments, but otherwise, these were the two that I had really been looking for. So I'm going to get into those this weekend. After I finish Tacumba, I've got to finish that. That was so great. That was a great interview. He was cool.
You know Tacumba, Irma, right? You know Tacumba.
No, I don't think so.
I thought you did.
Tacumba Tyrone Aiken.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know,
Oh,
say
yeah.
two. You know, say two, don't you? Say two Jones?
Yes, yes, yes.
So it's like say two and Tacumba. It's like saying one word, one person.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Okay. I
Join
think
at
I've
the hips
seen
and
his name. Yes, I think
Yeah.
you did an article on them together. Yes.
Yep, we did.
Okay.
Yusuf, what else you reading, man?
Well, I'm still wading my way through the 1619 project, and I'm rereading Richard Wright, The Outsider, which is where my name comes from, that book, that title. And my grandmother gave me a book by Richard Wright when I was 10 years old, and my life never been the same since. I mean, Hemingway said that Richard Wright not only came thundering out of the literary mountainside, but that he intimidated every white man with a typewriter in the United States and abroad. That's true. Yeah, every time I read Richard Wright, I read and I learn something new.
I just ordered Black Boy this morning online, and I'm going to go back through Richard Wright again. Irma, what are you reading? And let me, I envy Irma because she, among others, she sold me about anyway, had a personal relationship with James Baldwin, and has told me stories about James Baldwin being in her house, and I always say, man, wow.
The fire next time.
I am not your Negro.
And he was a very eloquent and humble person. That was the thing, is that he didn't walk around filled with himself. He was very generous and very humble and very caring. And the photographs that are in my archive, there are about 50 of them of Baldwin, many of them at his 60th birthday party, but catching him in private moments. And what you see is a different Baldwin. You see someone who's not always having to respond to the white gaze. It's just his personality as a warm, caring person really comes through, as opposed to the images you see on Netflix or some of these documentaries where he just seems to be so angry. And so that's what I love.
That softness came through on Bill Street. If Bill Street could talk,
yes,
the softness of his personality, it was there.
Well, his collection of essays, The Price of the Ticket, is my favorite. And he had a gift for taking a teaspoon and going into a 55-gallon barrel of BS and putting it out. Isn't this really the essence of what we're talking about? There are more Baldwin quotes that I put on emails than all the rest of the poets and authors combined, because he had a razor-sharp mind.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Irma, what you reading?
What are you reading, Irma?
Folks, I've been combating, preparing for lectures, and also dealing with time zones differences. So not much time for reading. Well, I am reading one book that I actually have here. It's called Our Separate Ways. I'm going to review it. I think I mentioned it last time. And I was able to meet with one of the authors, Stella Nkomo, who is actually here. I had lunch with her and her husband. Wow. She's retired now. She was the first Black woman to get a PhD in business at UMass Amherst, and I've been talking to her about being in my archive.
Awesome. Well, I'm still reading, among other things. This is, I think I showed this last time, The Resolutionaries, which I love the title because he talks about in his other books wanting to be and being a revolutionary, and over time, I think ascended in his personal development, and this is one of the consequences or the outcomes of it. I've shared this several times in the past few days in different chats, but I'd like to read the last paragraph of the book. And I'll read probably in the middle first, then to the very front of it, and then back to the end of it. But I'll read this last paragraph to close the program today. He says, our conversation will be about ways we've devised moving into future time and space, knowing our past, planning our future, and planning our future. From the time I moved into that perspective, home began to mean something larger to me. Family began to mean something infinitely greater than it meant before. Work took on meanings free of anguish, inspired with energy and reason to hope, Friendship flowed into the center of my life, where in the past, blood threatened to coagulate, choking my best thoughts to death. I wake up now knowing where I am going and with whom I'm walking, into what kind of future we would like to go. I found companions on the way going home. So that's what I think, in my mind, we're doing, is finding ways to get home to a place that is our place. With that, thank you all for being here.
Is that Aikwe Arma?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called The Resolutionaries. It's a wonderful book, a wonderful read. And like I said, before we're done, I'll be an ARMA expert because I'm into everything he's doing right now, and I'm loving it.
Good for you.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.
Safe travels, Dr. Irma.
Be safe.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay, will do.